The city of Los Angeles never truly slept. Even in the dead of night, its streets hummed with life, cars rolling lazily through dimly lit avenues, neon signs flickering like electric fireflies, and the occasional laughter of late-night wanderers echoing off concrete walls. Officer Brian Cooper had patrolled these streets long enough to know that quiet nights were often deceiving. Trouble had a habit of appearing when least expected. Tonight was supposed to be one of those routine shifts. Cooper sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, his partner, Officer Daniel Ruiz, in the passenger seat, sipping from a coffee that had long gone cold. Their radio crackled to life, breaking the stillness of the moment. Possible suspicious individual reported outside a 24-hour convenience store on Westbrook Avenue. Male suspect, mid-50s, wearing a cowboy hat and long trench coat, standing outside the store for an extended period. No reported crime, but caller felt uneasy. Units in the vicinity, please respond. Cooper rolled his eyes. Great, another paranoid civilian scared of their own shadow. Ruiz chuckled. Maybe we'll get lucky. Might just be a lost tourist or some guy waiting for a cab. Regardless of how trivial it seemed, a call was a call. Cooper turned on the patrol lights, not the siren, just enough to signal their presence, and guided the cruiser toward Westbrook Avenue. When they arrived, the convenience store's fluorescent lights cast a stark white glow onto the cracked pavement. The place was mostly empty, save for a clerk inside, mindlessly scrolling through his phone behind the counter. Outside, standing near the entrance, was the figure in question. The man stood tall, his posture relaxed yet commanding, as if he belonged to another time, like a gunslinger transported straight out of an old Western movie. He wore a rugged brown leather trench coat that fell to his knees, its edges slightly weathered. Beneath it, a fitted black t-shirt stretched across a broad, muscular chest. A cowboy hat sat firmly atop his head, casting a partial shadow over his face. His stance was calm, almost statuesque, his hands casually resting near his belt as he gazed at something in the distance, unmoving. Cooper furrowed his brow. Okay, that's different. Ruiz shrugged. I'll give him points for style. Despite the man's striking appearance, he wasn't doing anything illegal. He wasn't loitering in the way most vagrants did. No pacing, no aggressive panhandling, no glassy-eyed vacancy that signaled drugs or intoxication. But there was something about his presence, something that felt off. Cooper grabbed the radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 12. We have eyes on the individual, going to make contact. He stepped out of the patrol car, adjusting his duty belt, and approached with a firm but non-threatening posture. Sir, he called out, mind telling me what you're doing here? The man turned his head slowly. The moment his eyes met Cooper's, a strange tension filled the air. Not hostility, but something unshakable, something powerful. His gaze was sharp, piercing, but there was an unsettling calmness behind it, like an ocean before a storm. I was just enjoying the night, the man said, his voice deep, controlled, yet strangely familiar. Cooper squinted. That voice, there was something about it. But his instincts overrode his curiosity. He had dealt with smooth talkers before. ID, please. The man didn't move immediately. Instead, he regarded Cooper with an almost amused expression, as if waiting to see how far this would go. Is there a reason you need it? He asked. Cooper's patience thinned. Because you match the description of a suspicious person reported in this area. I need to confirm who you are. Now, if you don't have anything to hide, I suggest you comply. The man exhaled slowly, then reached into his coat pocket. His movements were deliberate, careful. He produced a worn leather wallet and handed it over. Cooper took it, flipping it open, his eyes scanning the name on the ID. Chuck Norris. Cooper's brow furrowed. Chuck Norris. He glanced back at the man, his mind working to piece things together. Now that he was really looking, he started noticing the details, the signature rugged features, the strong jawline, the unmistakable intensity in his stare. Recognition slammed into Cooper like a freight train. Holy sh**t. It's actually him. Ruiz, who had been standing behind Cooper, peeked over his shoulder at the ID. His jaw went slack. "Dude, that's Chuck Norris." But Cooper was already too deep in his authoritative mode. His pride refused to let him back down now. It didn't matter if this man was a movie star or some kind of martial arts legend. Out here, Cooper was the law. "All right, Mr. Norris," he said, trying to maintain control of the situation. "You should understand we have to check out every call that comes in. Do you have a reason for being out here so late?" Chuck Norris's lips curled slightly, not quite a smile but something close. "Do I need a reason to stand outside a store?" Cooper felt a heat rise to his face. He wasn't about to be made a fool of. "Look, sir, I need you to cooperate. Turn around, hands where I can see them." That was when the atmosphere shifted. Norris's posture remained relaxed, but something in his demeanor hardened. The ease in his stance didn't change, but suddenly, Cooper could feel the weight of an unseen force. A quiet, undeniable authority radiating from him. It was an unspoken warning, but Cooper was already too far gone. His hand instinctively went to his baton. Big mistake. Without hesitation, he yanked the baton from his belt and swung, aiming for Norris's midsection. The impact should have been solid. It should have sent the man doubling over in pain, at least staggering back. Instead, something impossible happened. The baton stopped. It had made contact, but it was as if Cooper had struck a solid steel post. There was no give, no recoil, nothing but an unyielding resistance that sent a shock through Cooper's wrist. His fingers numbed instantly from the impact, and the baton nearly slipped from his grip. Norris barely moved. He didn't flinch, didn't stumble. His eyes didn't even flicker. He simply stared at Cooper. And then, ever so slightly, he tilted his head. A silent question. Cooper's heart pounded. The realization crashed into him like a tidal wave. He had just made a terrible mistake. From behind him, Ruiz barely whispered, "OSH*T," and then Chuck Norris moved. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The air between Officer Cooper and Chuck Norris was thick with an unspoken tension. Cooper's grip on the baton loosened involuntarily, his fingers still tingling from the shock of striking something unmovable. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. He had hit plenty of people with that baton before, hardened criminals, violent drunks, even guys built like linebackers. But never, not once, had he felt something this solid. It was as if he had slammed his weapon into an iron pillar disguised as human flesh. Chuck Norris hadn't even flinched. The martial artist's gaze locked onto Cooper's, his expression unreadable. There was no anger, no malice, just a quiet, controlled understanding. It was the kind of look a seasoned warrior gave to an opponent who had just lost the fight before it even began. Officer Ruiz took an unconscious step back. "Cooper, man," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "We should." Too late. With a movement so fast it was almost imperceptible, Norris's hand shot forward. Before Cooper could react, his baton was no longer in his grasp. It had been ripped from his hand with terrifying ease. The next thing he knew, the baton was gone. Not dropped, not thrown, but sent flying through the air, spinning wildly before embedding itself into a nearby telephone pole with a sharp, echoing crack. The pole shuddered from the impact. Ruiz let out a strangled gasp. "What the hell?" Cooper stumbled back, his body moving on instinct. Every nerve screamed at him to create distance. He had faced all kinds of threats in his career, gang members, drug dealers, even an armed standoff once, but this was different. This was something beyond his understanding. Norris stepped forward. Not aggressively, not hurriedly, just deliberate, measured, like a lion closing in on its prey. Cooper's heart pounded against his ribs. His training told him to regain control of the situation, to assert dominance, but how? His weapon had been stripped away in less than a second. His instincts screamed that this was no ordinary civilian. What the hell was he supposed to do now? His fingers twitched toward his holster. Bad move. Norris saw it instantly. Before Cooper's fingers could even brush the grip of his firearm, Chuck Norris moved. To Ruiz and anyone watching, it was like watching a blur of motion, something too fast for the human eye to track. One moment, Cooper was reaching for his gun. The next, he was completely unarmed. His sidearm was in Chuck Norris's hand. Cooper's empty fingers twitched uselessly at his hip where the gun had been a split second ago. It was gone, snatched away with an ease that was downright supernatural. The weight of reality came crashing down on him. He was standing, unarmed, in front of Chuck Norris. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a death sentence. Ruiz held his hands up, stepping in cautiously. "Hey man," he said carefully, "we don't want any trouble." Norris didn't even look at him. His gaze remained locked onto Cooper, studying him. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, steady. "You just made a very big mistake, officer." Cooper swallowed hard. Norris flipped the gun in his hand, effortlessly, before tossing it back toward Cooper. It landed at his feet with a dull clatter. "I don't need weapons," Norris said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight heavier than any shout. Cooper's breath came fast and uneven. He looked down at his gun, then back at Norris. Every instinct screamed not to pick it up. Somehow, deep down, he knew. If he tried anything else, it would end very, very badly. Ruiz took another step back, his hands still up. "We didn't know who you were," he admitted, trying to defuse the situation. "Look, man, this was just..." Norris's head tilted slightly, his sharp blue eyes narrowing. "Does it matter who I am?" Ruiz hesitated, and that was the moment he realized. The issue wasn't that they had picked the wrong guy to mess with. It wasn't about Norris's fame. It was about respect. The silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Norris took a step back. The tension in the air remained, but the danger was fading. He had already won this encounter. Not with fists, not with violence, but with the simple, overwhelming fact that neither officer stood a chance against him. Cooper let out a shaky breath. His legs felt like they could barely hold him up. And then Norris turned to leave. That was it. No threats, no further confrontation. He had proven his point without laying a single hand on either officer. As he walked past them, he paused, just for a brief moment before speaking one last time. "Next time, be careful who you try to intimidate." And with that, he vanished into the night. Cooper and Ruiz stood there in stunned silence. Finally, Ruiz let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Dude," he muttered, "we almost got our asses kicked by Chuck Norris." Cooper didn't respond. He was still staring at the baton, still embedded deep into the telephone pole. A reminder of just how close he had come to making the worst mistake of his career. Slowly, he reached down, picked up his gun, and holstered it without a word. One lesson had been learned that night. Never, under any circumstances, mess with Chuck Norris. And if you ever do, pray he lets you walk away. The moment Chuck Norris moved, the air itself seemed to shift. Officer Cooper barely had time to react before a powerful force crashed into his chest. He stumbled back, nearly losing his footing. But Chuck Norris hadn't punched him. No, it had only been a gentle push. And yet, it felt like being hit by a truck. Cooper's breath hitched. His training screamed at him to regain control, to fight back. But a deep, primal part of his brain, the part that knew survival was more important than pride, told him that he was completely outmatched. Ruiz was frozen, still processing what had just happened. This wasn't supposed to go like this. This was just a routine stop, just another night on patrol. But now, somehow, they had wound up in a situation where their opponent was Chuck freaking Norris. Cooper's mind raced. He still had his taser, but something told him that if he even thought about using it, Chuck Norris would dodge before he could even pull the trigger. This wasn't a fight. This was survival. And then, before Cooper could make another move, one of the other officers panicked. A rookie, standing just a few feet away, reached for his gun. Biggest mistake of his life. The instant the rookie's hand touched his holster, Norris's body shifted. To the untrained eye, it looked like a blur of motion, too fast to register. But to someone like Cooper, who had been in plenty of physical altercations, it was terrifyingly precise. Norris spun. His legs snapped through the air like a whip, and the moment his foot connected with the officer's wrist, the sound was like a gunshot cracking through the night. The gun flew from the rookie's grasp and spiraled into the darkness, landing somewhere far beyond their reach. The officer yelped in pain, clutching his wrist as he stumbled back. Chuck Norris didn't press the attack. He simply lowered his leg, returning to a stance so effortless it was as if nothing had happened. The officers stood frozen in shock. No one had ever moved like that before. No one had ever been this fast, this precise, this controlled. Ruiz's mouth was dry. His mind screamed at him to do something, to stop this before it escalated. But what could he do? What could any of them do? They were facing a living legend. And then it finally clicked. Cooper's eyes widened. His breath caught in his throat. He finally recognized the man standing in front of him. The rugged face, the piercing blue eyes, the legendary power behind every movement. Chuck Norris. The Chuck Norris. The same Chuck Norris who had defeated entire groups of men without breaking a sweat. The same Chuck Norris who had fought off villains in movies, except now it was clear that those abilities weren't just acting. His heart plummeted. He had just tried to beat down Chuck Norris with a baton. Oh, my God. Ruiz must have realized it at the same time, because he let out a low, horrified whisper. Holy hell, it's Chuck Norris. The other officers started exchanging nervous glances, their confidence unraveling. The rookie, who had just been disarmed in a single motion, was white as a ghost. Cooper's throat went dry. He had screwed up badly. How the hell were they supposed to get out of this? The silence was oppressive. Chuck Norris stood still, his gaze steady, as if waiting for them to make the next move. Cooper knew there were only two possible outcomes. One, they could keep fighting, try to reassert their authority, and risk getting completely humiliated or worse. Or two, they could stand down and pray that Norris chose to be merciful. Cooper licked his lips. His hands trembled slightly, still feeling the phantom impact of the push Norris had delivered earlier. With great difficulty, he took a deep breath and forced himself to relax his stance. Ruiz noticed immediately. He hesitated for only a moment before following suit, slowly lowering his hands. The message was clear. We surrender. Norris studied them for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned his back to them and walked away. No threats, no final words, just a quiet, undeniable victory. As they watched him disappear into the night, Cooper exhaled shakily. We just survived Chuck Norris, Ruiz murmured. Yeah, Cooper whispered back. Barely. The baton lay on the pavement, reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. Chuck Norris bent down, his movements unhurried, and picked it up. The simple act sent another wave of dread washing over Officer Cooper. It wasn't just the action itself, it was the ease with which he did it. Norris twirled the baton once in his hand, almost as if he were testing its weight. Then, with a faint smirk, he extended it toward Cooper. You should train more, Norris said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made the hairs on the back of Cooper's neck stand up. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a threat. It was simply a statement of fact. Cooper, his mouth dry, nodded rapidly. Too rapidly. His throat worked as he tried to form words, but nothing came out. He could only accept the baton with shaking hands and pray that Norris had no further lessons to teach tonight. The other officers stood frozen, weapons lowered, not a single one daring to make another move. They had learned their lesson the hard way. This was not a man to be challenged. A hush fell over the street. The night air felt heavier than before. The sounds of the city, distant honks, muffled conversations from passers-by, seemed to fade, leaving only the rhythmic pounding of Cooper's heart in his ears. Chuck Norris gave them one last look. It wasn't a glare. It wasn't even an expression of superiority. It was the look of a man who had been through more battles than they could ever imagine. A man who understood power but chose not to abuse it. And then he turned and walked away. No grand speeches, no parting threats, just a silent, undeniable statement of dominance. With each step Norris took, Cooper felt the tension ease, but only slightly. It wasn't relief exactly. It was realization. They had just stood face to face with Chuck Norris. And survived. As soon as Norris disappeared into the shadows, Ruiz let out a shaky breath. Jesus, Cooper, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. We almost died. Cooper couldn't respond. He was still gripping the baton way too tightly, his knuckles turning white. "What the hell just happened?" one of the rookies whispered, his voice trembling. Nobody had an answer. One of the older officers, still pale, simply shook his head. "We got lucky." They all knew it. If Norris had wanted to, he could have ended that fight in seconds. They had drawn weapons on him. They had tried to subdue him. And yet, he had walked away untouched, and more importantly, so had they. Because he had allowed them to. The power dynamics of the entire situation had shifted the moment they realized who they were dealing with. They were trained officers of the law. They had been in fights, they had handled criminals, they had thought they were prepared for anything. But tonight had taught them something different. There were levels to power, and Chuck Norris was simply on another level. Cooper finally exhaled, loosening his grip on the baton. He felt like he had been holding his breath for an eternity. "You think he's gone?" one of the officers asked cautiously. "Does it matter?" Ruiz shot back. No one laughed. The tension still hung thick in the air. Finally, Cooper straightened up. He knew one thing for sure. He would never forget this night. The night he tried to fight Chuck Norris and lived to tell the tale.